Mikhail Viktorovich, about the city of St. Petersburg, there are many different versions of its origin. That is, there are big questions to the official version, that it was built by Peter the Great on an absolutely empty place. There are various assumptions and questions about how things like St. Isaac's Cathedral and the Pillar of Alexandria were built. I only named the most famous ones. What data and considerations do you have regarding the real history of St. Petersburg?
The question is clear. It is difficult to say what the real history of St. Petersburg was, but it is possible to announce the claims to the official version of St. Petersburg and its history. Well, let's take a look. Before the emergence of St. Petersburg, there is the Neva Delta. The Neva Delta is regularly flooded, so neither the Swedes nor the Novgorod princes have any thought to build any city here. If something has been built here, then these are some kind of temporary huts for the fishing and hunting season, some fortified points in some points of the landscape on some hills, and in general, nothing. Well, the question arises, why build a city on swamps? Further they begin to say, window to Europe. All right, a window to Europe presupposes solving what is now called the tasks of logistics, that is, export-import operations. And there is data that shows that until the moment when Putilov dug the sea channel and the St. Petersburg commercial port appeared, the cost of delivering cargo from London to Kronstadt was about the same as from Kronstadt to St. Petersburg and further.
That is, this is connected with the fact that the sea ship could not go directly to St. Petersburg itself. It had to unload.
Yes, this was connected with the fact that the depth before Kronstadt allowed a sea ship to calmly come to Kronstadt, if not all year round, then at least when the bay and the Baltic are free of ice. And further, in that fragment of the Gulf of Finland, which is called Nevskaya Bay or Markizovo Paddle, the average depth is 2.5 to 3 meters. And a sea ship could no longer pass there. The next question is also connected with this, with the depths of the Neva Bay. Petersburg is one of the capitals of the Russian shipbuilding industry. Well, when they say that the new admiralty, the old admiralty, the new admiralty is already the second half of the 19th century, near the time when the sea channel was built. And the old admiralty next to the Winter Palace. This is from the time of Peter I to the middle of the 19th century approximately. What was a warship of that era? This is a large structure made of wood. The height of the hull of ships of the first rank of 2-deck 84 cannon or 100 cannon ships of the first rank is 12 to 15 meters. Of these, 5.5 to 6 meters are below the water level. The length of the hull is 60 to 70 meters. The width is 12 to 15. That is, it is a rather large engineering structure. How to deliver it from the Neva, where it was built and where the depths allow it to be put on the water, to Kronstadt, to the main base of the Baltic Fleet, despite the fact that the depths of the Neva Bay are 2.5 to 3 meters. This is a separate, complex engineering work, and it was done in such a way that bundles of logs were threaded through the cannon ports of the lower decks. These logs protruded 6 meters or more beyond the dimensions of the hull. Barges ballasted with stone were brought under them. The barges floated up. After the stone was taken out of them, the ship was lifted on them, and 2 galleys dragged it to Kronstadt in about a day, where the same thing was repeated, but in the opposite order. Further, there is one more question related to how long the hull of a wooden ship serves. It serves differently.
You mean a military ship?
Yes. The warship, Nelson's flagship in Trafalgar, the 100-gun Victory, was over 100 years old at the time of battle, and after that, until the end of the 19th century, she was still afloat in the quality of a symbol and flagship of the British Navy, although in the second half of the 19th century, she did not go out to sea. Before she was docked, she, of course, underwent a major overhaul, but the resource of a correctly built hull, in conditions of correct operation and maintenance of a wooden warship of the 18th, 19th centuries, is 40 years or more, provided that it sails in salty ocean water. If the hull is in semi-fresh water of the Neva Bay or in the Kronstadt bays, where the water is about the same in salinity, then the hull decays within 15 to 20 years. And accordingly, in the Baltic, in order to maintain a certain size of the fleet, it was necessary to have twice the shipbuilding capacity than that capacity that would have been necessary if the main base was not in Kronstadt, but in Tallinn. That is, no matter how you look at it, Petersburg should not have arisen if we consider economic tasks, military tasks, but nevertheless it did arise. In an alternative version, if simply understanding all the problematics about which I have related, if to move away from it, then the capital of the Russian Empire should have become the city that is now called Tallinn. Moreover, Peter could have occupied the simple position: I don't know any Tallinns and Revels. This is the ancient Russian city of Kolivan. What is the result? Beautiful harbor with direct access to the Baltic Sea, higher salinity of water, accordingly a higher resource of the hulls of the naval and merchant fleets, a lower economic burden on shipbuilding, or with the same capacity of the shipbuilding industry, twice the fleet. Why did St. Petersburg arise? Many questions. And in general, the only version that allows you to answer the question as to why it arose, it is connected with the fact that when historians and archaeologists say that in St. Petersburg the cultural layer in the city center is 2.5 to 3 meters, then some geologists object. This is not a cultural layer, but the deposition of river and sea sediments. And accordingly, if the geologists are right, and in a number of cases on the territory of St. Petersburg, they find artifacts that do not fit into the official version of history, then the explanation of its appearance is simple. This is part of a global political project, the objective of which was to integrate into the architecture of the new capital the ruins of an ancient city, inherited from the antediluvian civilization, a city which was built in the era of a pre-global catastrophe that destroyed the past civilization. Well, it is clear that this version does not fit into the officialdom, but It is the only version that explains why Petersburg was built here, and not at least 20 kilometers upstream of the Neva, at least in the area where the Izhora flows into the Neva. In that area, there are no catastrophic floods, and there is no need for protective structures, and many problems are simply removed. But if there was a task, moreover a global political task, to falsify the history of global civilization and to reduce everything to what was later expressed in the history textbook of the Soviet era, that somewhere there, originated from a monkey, the first civilizations appeared 5,000 years ago, somewhere around 3,000 years of writing. Since that time we know everything reliably about our past. But if this version was the task of global politics, then the emergence of St. Petersburg, precisely in this place, is justified. Because all the resources were spent on hiding the ancient city, so that it would not prompt any questions as to where it came from and how and why, and simply to say that nothing happened. Since 1703 Petersburg exists, I love the city of Peter's making, and so on and so forth.
Then two questions. First, why did these people of a previous civilization build a city on a place after all floods?
And here there may be such an answer that before the global catastrophe, this city did not flood. Why? If we assume that the shape of the geoid of the figure that the planet Earth forms is set by the level of the world ocean, then the level of the world ocean is not a sphere. It is a completely different figure. And if the lithosphere revolves around the inner layers, then, depending on where a particular point is located on the lithosphere and how it has shifted relative to the world ocean level, it can be both above and below the level. Therefore, such a variant is not excluded. That if the city was built in ancient times, then, when it was built, it was a completely normal place that did not threaten any natural disasters, and people lived in the city quite comfortably. But when the global catastrophe occurred, and the lithosphere shifted relative to the core, it could have ended up in the place in which it found itself, and became a problem city, precisely in terms of the relationships with the physical factors of the region's nature after the climate changed, the geography of the planet changed, and much more.
The water level could have simply risen.
Even if the water level would remain the same, it is still the circumstance that the level of the world ocean is not a sphere, and the variation in the difference in radii at different points of the planet reaches tens of meters. Then this is quite enough, with the shifting of the lithosphere in relation to some one position, that some areas of the former sea and ocean bottom would be exposed, while other areas would go underwater or end up on the coast in close proximity.
It's funny, and we measure the height above sea level. And if it is different in different places, then where is the level?
It is simply that the level is under the impact of gravitational forces, and the fact that the lithosphere does not float anywhere quickly, it is more or less stable, makes it a good basis for counting. But then the little things begin. that there are centrifugal forces, the Earth is spinning. Under the impact of centrifugal forces, the water flows to the equator. In the zone of the poles, it is less. But besides this, the acceleration of gravity is also different at different points of the Earth. Since the Earth is inhomogeneous from the point of view of its physics. There are also gravitational inhomogeneities, plus the Moon in orbit. Therefore, the surface that is set by the level of the world ocean is far from a sphere, and it is not even a regular ellipsoid. It is something close to an apple, in a less pronounced shape than an apple. If you look from a distance, then this is a sphere. But if you are engaged in more accurate measurements, then this is not a sphere.
And then returning to history, the second question. Perhaps you know where in St. Petersburg these remains of the ancient city are. Or what could they be?
There is a lot of talk on this theme. There are sites where this theme is discussed in detail. There, such statements are derived that the volume of processing of granite stones and the volume that lies in the form of foundations and basements of St. Petersburg buildings, it is beyond the limit for those technologies' energy supply capacity that were.
And there is a lot around the Neva too.
And there's a lot around the Neva too. But if the Neva is still here and there are practically no megaliths. Something can be brought either on a barge or on a sleigh, or on a cart, but all the same, the volumes are large. Further, such things as the Alexander Column, Isaac's Colonnade. We see Montferrand's drawings on the sites where the version is being discussed that at the basis of St. Isaac's are more ancient structures that are integrated into its architecture. There are reproductions of engravings on which St. Isaac's is present, although the engravings date to the time when St. Isaac's was not supposed to be. Further, there are such questions that there are drawings, and if you calculate from the point of view of theoretical mechanics, the technologies that the drawings presuppose.
You mean the installation of these pillars, columns?
Yes, I mean all these auxiliary structures, ramps, and so on and so forth. The number of personnel who took part in the lifting work, whether there was enough efficiency, whether the efficiency of these chain hoists was enough to deliver. When it comes to history, you can write anything you want in words. But when it comes to concretics, and figurative thinking is turned on, many questions arise that historians cannot answer due to the fact that they do not have any specific education, either biological or geological or technical. And when professionals who have this knowledge look at history, questions arise related to dating and how all of this was built. Yes, of course, many technologies are lost. Something could have been done manually because a lot is forgotten. All the same, a lot of questions arise. And historians who have mastered only chronology, which is not known how and where it came from, who refer to texts that are not always reliable, in addition, that were filtered out in the historical past, who do not report much about what was in reality. So the question about an adequate conception of the historical past is really relevant. If we talk about alternative versions, the conception of Fomenko and Nosovsky, everything is not so simple there either. Because on the one hand, the mathematical apparatus really allows you to calculate a lot and raise certain questions. But as many applied mathematicians said, mathematics is a millstone from which, whatever you pour into it, you will get out of it. And further, let us look at specific examples. The novel by Morgan Robertson, Futility, in all details describes the death of the Titanic, dated 1898. 14 years before the actual events. Suppose the following situation. Somewhere in the 25th century, historians of that time read texts describing this catastrophe. And suddenly they come across the novel Futility, which dates back to 1898. What conclusion will there be? The dating of the novel is incorrect. It could not have been written earlier than 1912 because there are no prophecies. Such random coincidences, well, from the point of view of our natural science, from the point of view of our philosophy, are simply impossible. And the question of the fact that history is algorithmic, and the algorithmicness of history is expressed in the chronology of events, and that humanity in the course of the historical process, by the method of successive approximations, is solving certain nravious ethical tasks. And due to the fact that it solves them by the method of successive approximations, history repeats itself in plots. But in a different historical setting, in different geographic locations, with some variation in roles between participants in different eras. All this is what the methodics of Fomenko and Nosovsky does not touch on. The second question has to do with the fact that somewhere in their works, there was an assertion that they deny the purpose-oriented falsification of history. They say all this happened somehow by accident. But if you look at history from the position of the sufficiently general theory of governance, recognizing the conception of the noosphere as not the delirium of Teilhard de Chardin and Vernadsky, then the historical process appears as hierarchical, multi-leveled, governed. And the history of different societies, this is the history of the governance towards these societies. And then it turns out that yes, the apparatus proposed by Fomenko and Nosovsky allows to calculate a lot, but the interpretation from the position of the sufficiently general theory of governance, on the condition that the being of God and His almightiness is recognized, and the fact that the noosphere is a part of reality, and it exerts an impact on the life of each of us, and each culturally peculiar society is recognized, then the interpretation of the calculated results will be completely different.
Curious. It turns out that if history is cyclical, and humanity, let's say, must learn from its mistakes, if not even all of humanity as a whole, then some peoples. For them, something is repeated there, then these mistakes should be described. Relatively speaking, that we then mess up something there. It turned out badly. So guys, next time let's...
This theme is described in the materials of the conception of social safety in the work Time of Troubles in Rus, the emergence, and so on, the course, and overcoming. It shows the cyclics of the history of Rus. Related to this is the question of how to understand Chuchev's words. Who would grasp Russia with the mind? Her soul is of a special kind, by faith alone appreciated. And the main thing is that, for her, no yardstick was created. Firstly, this quatrain of Tyutchev, it is in many ways metaphorical. It is largely conditioned by the fact that Tyutchev received a standard European type of education. Yardstick in this evaluation by him is a kind of metaphor. For what? A metaphor for living standards. The common yardstick is the European yardstick, the European living standards of the second half of the 19th century. To Russia, according to Tyutchev, they are inapplicable. Why are they inapplicable? Now let's look at what is happening in the European Union now, and what happened in Russia, in Russian civilization, during the time of Ivan the Terrible. Let us take the technosphere out of consideration. From the time of Ivan the Terrible, Russia has been building a multicultural society. From the time of Ivan the Terrible, Russia has a unified credit financial system. From the time of Ivan the Terrible, a unified system of standards of measures and weights has been formed in Russia. From the time of Ivan the Terrible, a kind of ethics has been formed in Russia, into which representatives of all different cultures fit, preserving their natural characteristics. And all this exists in a way harmoniously and develops despite the periodically emerging catastrophes of culture. What is happening now in Europe? If you look at it in such a way, an attempt to move from a multitude of nation-states of nations to a single multicultural society. An attempt to move away from national credit financial systems to a common European credit financial system. That is, the European Union is now unsuccessfully trying to solve those tasks that in Russia were more or less successfully solved from the time of Ivan the Terrible to the time when Tyutchev wrote his quatrain. But the question arises, what then happens in Russia if the standards that have been developed in Europe are those standards that were in this or that way worked out in Russia several centuries ago and were retransmitted there, egregorially, noospherically? And the essence of the matter is that Russia, during the period when Tyutchev wrote this quatrain, and at a later time, was working out the standards of the future era. Those standards are different standards, and they don't fit into the common European yardstick. But since Tyutchev received a European education, then, in terms of European education, he could not clearly say this in certain terms, but he could only point to this matter metaphorically. I have no doubt that the liberals will scream that Europe and America are the locomotive of civilization, the leader of civilizational development, that everything that has been said here on this theme is nonsense. But nevertheless, the problems of Europe, they are such that after Breivik did his job, all the leaders of European countries recognized the collapse of the conception of multiculturalism. But if the collapse of the conception of multiculturalism, then this means that the European Union has no future until such time as it generates an intelligible, life-consistent conception of multiculturalism. This is really a very relevant question. Because if you look at the Soviet past, what was the Soviet past characterized by? Precisely by that which truly was multiculturalism. And this multiculturalism, if you do not consider the elite that emerged in the USSR, it was really organic in the life of ordinary people. and there were no problems. What my father told me: during the war, replenishment came from Kazakhstan. The rank and file, the majority, do not speak Russian. What to do? It turns out, who speaks Russian? There are several people. Those who speak Russian are appointed as gun commanders. Those who do not speak Russian, numbers in gun calculations. Fire control is simple. Commands are given in Russian. As soon as they reach the gun commanders, then they are relayed in Kazakh. The battery is combat ready. 2 or 3 months pass, the language barrier has been eliminated. Everyone has mastered the Russian language to the extent that is necessary for life in the conditions of that time. That is, the problems were solvable. But again, many are puzzled by what was commonly called the Stalinist national policy. That which is called the Stalinist national policy, it also cannot be understood without the sufficiently general theory of governance. Chingiz Atmanov's story, The First Teacher, it is about the fact that a certain national policy is being formed. When a semi-literate Russian-speaking soldier teaches a girl in an awl, and then she becomes a doctor of sciences. Yes, in the USSR the language of science is Russian, but science incorporates representatives of all nationalities that exist in the USSR. The sphere of governance also absorbs, with amendments to the tribal system as the inertia of the past, also representatives of all nationalities that exist in the USSR. And here we come to an unpleasant theme for liberals, which is called the problem of the exploitation of man by man, and the eradication of this very exploitation. From the point of view of liberals, there is no problem, because an entrepreneur, he is not an exploiter of other people's labor. He is a benefactor. He created an enterprise that employs other people, and he gives them a livelihood. If it were not for him, they would lose their livelihood. And everything connected with economic inequality, this is, the market is an objective regulator. It correctly and fairly sets the price for everything in accordance with the needs of society, including the price of labor in a certain profession. If you don't like the quality of your life, work more, master new professions, and make your labor more in demand, more competitive in the labor market, and you will live better. If you don't like working as an employee, give us a business plan, take out a loan, collect investors, and go ahead. As an example, Bill Gates and someone else shows that this is quite real. They made themselves, and everything is fine. Now let's take a look at a different perspective. The informational algorithmic support for the life of the biological species Homo sapiens. What is it like? First of all, these are instincts and innate reflexes. This is an innate component that works to ensure the simple reproduction of a biological species at a zero level of culture. Culture is a superstructure on top of that, but culture is also an informational algorithmic system. This is a factor that exerts an impact on the process of personal formation of any representative of any generation. But if culture is an informational algorithmic system, It means that culture carries in itself a certain set of objectives and a certain set of means to achieve these objectives. The determinedness of the set implies its finiteness, and accordingly there are some objectives for which this culture either in principle cannot work, or which are forbidden in it. Accordingly, it turns out that national cultures, in the form in which they have taken shape in historical development, they are not identical to each other as informational algorithmic systems. And if, for example, we draw an analogy with the computer world, then Word can work well with text, but drawing in Word and processing photos is not its business. And other programs allow you to draw more or less clearly and process photos and images, and everything related to text is there to a minimum. With national cultures, the situation is exactly the same. In the conditions of multiculturalism, when in one and the same society there are different informational algorithmic systems that are not identical to each other in terms of objectives and their methods of achieving them, then even if we assume the absence of mutual hostility between people, then in the conditions of the economy, it will be that someone can work in certain professions because he grew up in a certain culture where there is informational algorithmic support for activities in these professions. And someone will not be able to work for the simple reason that in his national culture there is nothing about these objectives, ways and methods of achieving them. Further, market regulation takes place. And market self-regulation in the conditions of a liberal market economic model is such that an ethnic division of labor develops when some sit in banks and shovel money, while others toil at 3 jobs, having neither free time nor time for personal development. And this is what liberalism calls fair. The Stalinist national policy was aimed at eliminating the exploitation of man by creating such conditions for the development of national cultures in order that at the end of the process, representatives of any nationalities would master the creative potential at such a level that the ethnic division of labor and economic inequality connected with the labor market conjuncture would disappear and become a thing of the past. The problem of multiculturalism in Europe, this is precisely the fact that they do not want to deal with the question of what is the exploitation of man by man, and how it is realized in concrete historical forms, and what should be done in order for the exploitation of man by man to disappear, and accordingly for national oppression to disappear, when representatives of some nations toil from morning to evening, and representatives of other nations have a lot of free time, are not answerable for anything, shovel money with a spade, and they are all swimming in chocolate. Until such time as Europe deals with this, the European Union will not exist. As for Russia, what happened after 1991 is a rollback into the past. It is not progress. Because the progress of Russia is also the building of a multinational culture, in which there would be no exploitation of man by man. But this is again incompatible with the liberal market economic model. But further, there is one more aspect. We are sitting in a room talking about it. We are ordinary citizens. And in the Duma we have the Communist Party. And to the next Duma elections, as many as 2 communist parties will go. Already the second Communist Party has started up. But the leaders of neither one nor the other. For many decades, Zhuganov has been keeping mum about the problem of exploitation of man by man and the need to eradicate it. So new ones have not yet begun and are unlikely to begin. That is, this is yet another indicator that the Duma and the Parliament are not a place for discussion. As Comrade Rogozin said in the old days, the bazaar is being filtered there. Certain thematics are closed for discussion. If it comes up in the discussion, then those who raised questions disappear from the next composition of the Deputy Corps. An example of this is the parliamentary hearings on the conception of social safety of 1995, from the time of which 20 years have passed. After these parliamentary hearings, their initiators somehow disappeared from the parliamentary corps. This is again on the theme of who conducts casting.
Whoever gives money to the parties conducts the casting, including the same Communist Party. And alas, it's not the Bolsheviks who give it to it, but the capitalists.
Yes, that is, there are problems.
Processes have been launched to dismantle the United States and to erode European culture. Does this mean that after the collapse of the United States and Europe, it is possible that the generator of the biblical project will stop and it will decline?
The biblical project is a specific variation of crowd elitism in general. That is, this is not something out of the ordinary, but this is a specific variety that dominated history, which carried global politics throughout the time of, well, depending on which chronology one uses, either the last millennium or the last about 3,500 years. Therefore, if the states are being drained and the European Union is being flushed down the drain, then it is not the biblical project that is being flushed down the drain. They flush away the liberal market economic model as a generator of the biospheric ecological crisis, and that's it. It could not be flushed down the drain by socio-cultural means, because Marxism was supposed to solve the problem of eliminating the liberal market economic model on a global scale and replacing it with crowd elitism on the basis of Marxist ideology. When there is a semblance of democracy, everyone is fed, shod, dressed, but nonetheless, power, it still does not come from the people, but it comes from the curators of the project, who at one time released Marx to the public and cultivated Marxism. Now this problem is being solved by other means. If it was not possible in the 19th, the first half of the 20th century, to liquidate the liberal market economic model by socio-cultural means, then now the task has been set: to destroy the biomass that carries the liberal bourgeois market culture. How to destroy it? Simple. To activate the processes of biological degeneration and cultural degeneration, and to replace the indigenous population of Europe and the Anglo-Saxon part of the American population with another population. And these processes are going on, because the task is simple: to drive the first generation of immigrants there, then they multiply intensively. They are the carriers of a different culture, different traditions. They too are crowd elitist, the creative potential is suppressed. And automatically, we come to the conclusion that after a while, there will be no Europe in the form in which it was in the 20th century. But Europe is also given a choice, because if you look in such a way, then what is happening there is supposed to cause a surge of nationalism, up to and including Nazism. Breivik studies political science while sitting in prison. The fact that he alone could not have done what was written off on him is a fact. And Breivik is a project. Alternatively, if the outbursts of nationalism with the transition to Nazism in Europe are large enough, then Europe may return to the SS Charter of 1944 in direct form, without any liberal wrappers and shells. And Breivik or someone else is the Führer of the European Union. But then, for the immigrants who came there and their children, either concentration camps or forced deportation, or naturalization through some complex procedures that will be aimed at making them lose their initial national cultural identity.
It turns out that now half of the world is looking to the West. After the draining of the West, they will look to Russia or at China, right? While in Russia, Christian Orthodoxy will not be able to live without the West, because they constantly look to them, the Vatican in particular. And what will remain then? The Quran?
In general, if we talk about historically formed confessions, then all of them, in one form or the other, one way or the other, by these or those means, suppress the religiosity of any person. If by religiosity we mean the dictatorship of Soviet, that is, they all must in some way change and must come to the conclusion that a ritual is a ritual and the dictatorship of Soviet is true religiosity. That is, the confessions will have to either transform or go into the past in the form in which they have now taken shape.
And if they become a thing of the past, then will it be necessary to work out a new religious system?
Why do you need to work one out? The dictatorship of Soviet? Everyone has Soviet. The main thing is not to trample it while the child is growing.
We spoke about population replacement. In Europe, it's understandable, migrants. About the United States, how will population replacement be carried out there?
The Chinese have already come there. In Canada, the Chinese directly say that, "Where are the Native Americans, guys? What have you got to do with it? What are your claims to this territory?"
There are not only Chinese people there. There are Indians, Afghans.
There are many, but these are all carriers of cultures for which the liberal bourgeois economic model is alien.
Why?
Because in these cultures, there are still some ethical restrictions on trade. If in the liberal market economic model, everything which is bought is sold, then in the traditional cultures of other peoples, far from everything is sold and far from everything is bought. And honor, in a sense, is higher than income. Therefore, they are the carriers of different cultures, different principles of organization of the economy.
But they learn quickly.
This is another side of the question. Because when people come here, the surrounding ethnic environment is the habitat on account of which the diaspora survives. It is the same there. But further, the question is, does the diaspora degrade into a lumpen, or does the diaspora retain its Nravious ethical values and further, in the continuity of generations, replace the indigenous population? In the States and in Canada, The process is going precisely in the second direction. And the Chinese in the third generation living in the States and the Japanese in the third generation living in the States, these are, first of all, Japanese and Chinese, and only then, citizens of America.
Then the question is, why was it necessary to replace Europe after the Second World War?
Because the Marxist project did not take place.
But it could have been done in more different ways.
And what other ways? It was necessary to give another ideology which would be an alternative to the liberal bourgeois one. That is, it would deny capitalism in the form in which it was, and would limit the consumption race. In the second quarter of the 20th century, there were two such ideologies: National Socialism and International Socialism. They set up an experiment. Who is stronger? National Socialism was crushed. Then the tribal system, under the conditions of the International Socialism of the USSR, brought down International Socialism. Once again, a choice is on the agenda: either the eradication of the European peoples or their return to National Socialism on the basis of the 1944 SS Charter.
But for these tools are somehow too big in terms of these refugees, migrants and others. This has been going on for several decades.
A spectrum of some solutions and a multivariate scenario are selected. Any outcome in this multivariate scenario should be acceptable. If the task is to eradicate the liberal bourgeois economic model on a global scale, if European peoples disappear and are replaced by a non-cultural population, has the problem been solved?
As a whole, yes.
If Europe goes over to National Socialism, has the task been solved? It has also been solved. Any variant is acceptable. Further on, both work in the mode of self-governance to the measure of their understanding.
And the third variant is that, in Europe, they've happily cut each other down for decades.
Let's move on to a broader scale of consideration and look at the caliphate.
That is, it is simply more distant in time.
Yes, more distant in time, and so on. Moreover, the caliphate is initially a nuclear power, due to the fact that Pakistan is a nuclear power.
The race, let's say, of consumption. It did not arise even after the Second World War. It is the brainchild of somewhere around the 80s.
This is not the brainchild of the 80s. This is an earlier phenomenon because the consumption race, under the conditions of the strata caste system, it was impossible in principle. Because in the conditions of the strata caste system, the merchant of the third guild did not have the right to live by the standards of the merchant of the first guild. He had to pay someone there in order to move to the guild. To say nothing of the fact that in many cultures, there were direct prohibitions on the consumption of any goods by representatives of lower classes. After all, that royal deer on which Robin Hood and his comrades poached, it is not just that, a beautiful metaphor that the deer is beautiful because it's royal. It is truly royal. Hunting it was allowed only to the king and those whom the king allowed. For the rest, it is poaching. Sturgeon is a royal fish. If on the territory of the same Great Britain, someone caught a sturgeon and ate it with his friends, this was a crime against the crown. First, the sturgeon must be offered to the crown, and if the crown refuses, then it can be eaten. And restrictions of this kind, they, in conditions of the strata caste system, were, and they excluded the race of consumption. And the guild organization of the economy, also connected with the strata caste system, blocked the accelerated development of science and technology. And when the strata caste system was destroyed, and the wallet and the level of income became the measure of social status, then the consumption race began. But these are already the first bourgeois revolutions and the liberal market bourgeois ideology. It gave rise to the conception of a hired state because by the end of the era of feudalism, when the bourgeoisie had already taken shape as a class, it controlled a fair share of the economy with practically no rights whatsoever. They demolished the strata caste statehood into monarchies. Constitutional, not constitutional, it is not important. But in general, the noble corporation and the aristocracy, this was the cadre base of state governance, and everyone else was on the sidelines. They began to desire political power besides economic power. They swept them away. And then it turns out that the resources of the human psyche are not enough to do business and engage in politics professionally. What to do? Hired state. We pay you the loot, and you serve us and enforce the laws. And in Russia, the conception of the state is of a different kind. The state is supposed to be all people's, and everyone should contribute to the social associations of labor, regardless of what kind of formation there is from the point of view of Marxism, feudalism, capitalism, and so on and so forth. If you look into history, and everything that was written by church and non-church thinkers about the state in that era, and everything that was written in the Soviet era about the state, the ideal is the all-people state, which guarantees a certain social security to each and every one, provided that he dobrosovestiously serves the common interests represented by the state. And problems begin in Russia only when some social group tries to subjugate the state to itself and make it an instrument for the satisfaction of self-servingness to the detriment of all other social groups. As soon as it comes to this, that is it. Political crisis, the state loses support, the governorial core degrades, a social catastrophe, a new statehood that claims to be all people. Until such time as a new elite emerges, and until such time as it begins to degrade, Russia develops successfully.
You said that the strata caste system slows down consumption, but nevertheless, there were lower strata on it, which use little, and there were upper strata, on which there were palaces, huge hallways, canals, stables.
Yes, this was. But nonetheless, again, if we talk about this very consumption, then the absence of scientific technological progress is practically complete. It provided in general the stability of consumption. But when technogenic energy appeared, and it formed the basis of the economy, and the strata class system was dismantled, then the more energy, the more you can produce. And if yesterday you were a slave and a peasant, or who knows what else, but today you have made billions, then you can already live by the highest standards as the Tsars never dreamed of. And as a result, it turns out that the social group that now lives on a global scale in a way that the Tsars never dreamed of in the 18th and 19th centuries is already numerically larger than the privileged social groups in the strata caste system at the end of the 18th century. And the volumes of their consumption are also higher. And in the liberal market economic model, there are no factors that would limit this. If there are no factors, then the development of technology, the development of consumption, leads to the destruction of biocenoses, since apart from monetary restrictions, there are none. For example, we have Lakhtinsky Razliv here, a place on the migration route of birds from the tundra to the south and back. An alternativeless place. What do? Yes, we build. There, from each square meter of reclaimed and poured soil, you can make so much dough. The problem of consumption without restrictions on the basis of a liberal market economic model is present, and this problem is not solved in the liberal market economic model. Since it is easier to artificially organize demand for these or those goods on account of the fashion industry, on account of deliberate reduction of resource indicators, and as a result, the resources of the planet are uselessly ground.
Why then are these owners of the earth so slow? This was clear back in the 19th century.
So they started Marxism in order to eliminate this problem. It is not that they are slow. The fact is that they do not possess omnipotence. By strength of the fact that they do not possess omnipotence, the Almighty, to that which they do, adds concomitant effects that either devalue the result they achieve or lead to the impossibility of its implementation. Last time it was said that some people are inclined to elevate to the rank of the Almighty what is called the world behind the scenes. But the world behind the scenes is not the Almighty, and its powers, competence, and functional capability are significantly lower than is necessary in order for it to achieve its objectives, precisely in the aspect of building a civilization in which a person will be a zombie and will not become a human.
In this regard, the question about the world behind the scenes is connected with the fact that they govern this way. I mean structuralist governance. In order not to take some kind of karma feedback for their governance,
Karma is a concept from Vedic culture, and the fact that the responsibility in front of the Almighty for the deed can never be avoided. This is already beyond the bounds of karma. That is, yes, you can walk through a minefield, bypassing, you can mine roads, and knowing the map of minefields, you yourself cannot be undermined, but live off the meat that is undermined. But at some stage, you will have to give an answer for the fact that you are engaged in the mining of clean paths.
apparently, they do not stand before such a question.
It does not yet stand before someone, but it will stand.
We started talking about projects. The question is, how did the various races appear on Earth? Your opinion.
I never thought about it. There are several versions that each era has its own race, but the survivors live. There are versions on the theme that these are mutations. There are versions on the theme that these are generally different in their origin, but according to the same blueprints, the species is made, brought to Earth, and so on and so forth. But still, if we speak in essence, then a person is not a body. A person is a soul. And the body is in relation to the soul in much the same way as the car is in relation to the body.
Let's go back a little. Concerning St. Petersburg, if we accept the theory that you said, that there was a very ancient city, and then St. Petersburg was built around it, it turns out that after all, Peter, or somewhere around his era, built on the old ruins. Question: did he receive such a command from the global predictor or from the world behind the scenes?
By all appearances, yes. Moreover, if you read the works of Marx and Engels, they also analyzed history. then they have rather hysterical texts on the theme that the great British Empire in the era of Peter was simply working for Russia. But if this was a global political project, then the British Empire, as a part of global politics and the leader of globalization in that era, was obliged to solve the tasks that it solved precisely in the aspect of ensuring Peter's politics both scientifically, methodologically, and economically. And accordingly, from the standpoint of British nationalists, it was state treason, since the nationalists had no idea about global politics and saw the world only through the prism of the British conception of globalization and the building of the British Empire, on whose territory the sun never sets. But since the real power belongs not to the Queen's clan, but the Queen's clan heads the program adaptive module power, but everything that is higher in the aspect of global politics, its objectives, its methods of implementation, then if it was decided that Peter Alexeyevich was entrusted with a certain reform in Russia, and it lacks cadre and economic resources, lacks scientific methodological support, then the whole of Europe is obliged. Whoever considered that this was not so, he probably had some difficulties in his political and scientific career, and we simply do not know these people.
If global politics is primarily about governance, how governance is now carried out is understandable. There are communication facilities and means of transport are modern. How was global politics? How was global governance carried out in antiquity? After all, such efficiency.
The point is that such efficiency, in general, is not the basic toolkit in this sphere. The basic toolkit is the formation of the world understanding of new generations for the solution of certain tasks. The generations grow up, the world understanding has been formed, the generations operate on the principles of self-governance. If they are inconsistent in the aspect of the methodology of cognition and creativity, then they will never guess that they are working for the solution of other people's tasks in the mode of the bear from the tail, tops and roots.
And they will terribly laugh when they are told about it.
Yes, and they will laugh terribly, like some truckers. Fyodorov addressed them on the theme that allegedly, guys, the Plato system is not in pursuance of the president's policy, you are being used. And they answered, what, are you high? I myself am so smart. How can I be used when I anyway already know everything? So, there we are.
According to the Plato system, is it most likely a redistribution of finances within the country?
I don't know what's there. You see, on the one hand, yes, indeed, a 12-ton truck destroys a road that was made with the expectation that a 1.5-ton truck would drive on it, and perhaps not every day. You can't get away from this. The road network really needs to be reconstructed. But if we talk about funding sources, then the best variant is to violate the Russian banking system on the theme of building interest-free crediting, and further the implementation of the emission policy in accordance with the energy backing for the ruble, maintaining a certain standard. If, at the same time, you enter the economy into a mode of progressive decline in prices to the measure of the growth of production and satisfaction of needs, then thereby you leave the liberal market economic model with all its problems, acquire economic sovereignty, and acquire economic power that enables you to solve many problems of a social, economic, and biospheric ecological character without straining either truckers or anyone else. Reconstruction of the road networks in this case is one of the particular tasks, which is solved in passing. But here again, there is no such thing as ownerless, malicious intent. Because if someone is not able to grasp some things, or he does not have enough political will to do them, look behind the scenes for someone who manipulates and understands everything as it's needed.
Okay, then a question. If we take the Earth, take this global predictor, or the owners of the Earth, if you say that the main task of a person is to develop psychically, spiritually, as if to his genetically determined potential, these are the words from the conception of social safety, then what is the objective of these malchishis, cabalchishis who are sitting there, now ruling the Earth? And they do everything incorrectly. The liberal market economy, the decline in righteousness, and all these things. What is their objective? To be kings on the planet of the apes or some other?
The objective is for the planet to remain the planet of the apes, and then you can do a lot with them if the theme goes beyond the planet.
That is, this is an interplanetary conquest perhaps of some kind.
This may not only be an interplanetary conquest. These are questions of how we understand religiosity. Because if we talk about the Quran, in the Quran, Iblis is not a fictional character.
Who is this?
This is that comrade who in the Christian tradition is called Satan, Lucifer. In the Quran, there is an episode. God commanded the angels to worship man. They all bowed. Iblis didn't. I won't. Why? And I'm better than him. You created me from pure flame, and them from the dust of the earth. I will harm them. Well, fine, harm, but within the boundaries of these very allowances. Anyway, you don't know what God knows, it will still be the same. That is, if we talk about development, then development can be in two versions. Either a person is imbued with love, and on this basis, he develops on the basis of internal stimuli, or if he is not imbued with love, he will anyway develop under the pressure of external circumstances until such time as he is imbued with love. If he categorically does not want to be imbued with love, then there comes a moment when he is removed from the track, often long before the exhaustion of the biological resource of his organism. Because there is such a topic on the theme that if the biosphere is a living organism, then there must be an immune system. If an individual personally comes into conflict with the biosphere and does not behave in the way it is due, then how should the immune system react? It must deal in the destruction of all pathogenic animals that live in the organism. In humans, this is what the immune system does. But the human immune system is part of the immune system of the biosphere. And if a command comes from the level of the biosphere on the theme that the given individual is behaving incorrectly, then his inherent immune system turns off, and after that he successfully dies. But if he is convinced that he is always right, he is the crown of creation, then from his point of view, a disease is a mistake of nature, which he must suppress through pharmacology and other technologies of medicine. But again, medicine in the European tradition is a set of technologies that are not obviously ethically conditioned, not in the aspect of who carries them, nor in the aspect of their application to a specific patient. Because in some cases, in order for a person to recover and be healthy, It is enough to explain to him how he messes up. And if he stops messing up, then, within a reasonable time frame, his health improves by itself, despite the efforts of medicine even.
Then how to explain that such bad people like Mikhail Gorbachev, like Brzezinski, Kissinger and other guys have such an enviable longevity?
Well, firstly, some are given time to bethink themselves.
How? Life is already...
If we talk again about Kissinger, we must look at the society in which he lived and lives, how it formed him, and what he did. Because if we speak in essence, then Kissinger was never a supporter of a military solution to the conflict between the USSR and the United States. That is, the system in which Kissinger grew up is wrong. But if we talk about the global system, then far from everything that Kissinger did is an alternativeless evil.
It turns out that if a person does not realize that he is doing evil, his совесть is clear, then...
This is also directly stated. Where you made a mistake, there is no sin. The only sin is that which you have maliciously machinated. And everyone has the right to a certain mistake. If we talk about such subjects as Hitler, who is considered to be one of the personifications of evil, then in the activities of Hitler there is a certain blago. Because, you see, if in the 20s someone would have said that the nraviousness of Europe and its ethics is such that what was in the conditions of the Third Reich would come to be, he would have been sent to his starting positions, being accused of slandering civilized humanity. Thanks to the activities of Gorbachev, Hitler, and many others, a lot of all negativity, which, in an alternative version of history, would have been potential, ready for action, it manifested itself in life. And the need to eradicate it, it would have been denied by many, alleging, "You slander us. This is not characteristic of us. We are so good, fluffy, blago intended, and in general." Well, you were given freedom. What happened? Wild capitalism of the 17th and 18th centuries.
Do you mean the 90s?
Yes, the 90s.
Wild bandit capitalism.
Yes, wild bandit capitalism. And the justification is, it is not us who are like this, but the time is like this. But you generated the time.
Yes, and everyone was raised in the USSR.
Yes, everyone was raised in the USSR. The same Yegor Timurovich, member of the editorial board of the Communist Journal, that is, one of the educators of the Soviet people, and its vanguard, the Communist Party, since the journal Communist is a scientific theoretical magazine. According to the rating, if not counting scientific journals, but social publicistic ones, this is the #1 journal in the USSR.
Another question about the global predictor, or rather about its physical representatives. As far as I understand, the global predictor is the successor of the previous civilization. Accordingly, we do not know exactly what the creatures of the previous civilization were. They were not necessarily the same as you and me. That is, they could somehow be genetically different.
Yes.
Accordingly, if these are their successors, then can they also differ physically and genetically from ordinary people?
Well, I don't know to what extent they may differ, but even if we proceed from the position that they do not differ, then the process of upbringing and the deployment of the genetic program for the development of the organism is variative. And you can raise a moron from a generously gifted by God person, or on the same biological basis, you can raise someone who will be superior in senses in the culture of personal psychic activity in impacting the world. And between them, when they are adults, there will be nothing culturally in common. Their relation towards this culture will be the same as we have to the operating system of a computer. Yes, you need to know in order to operate with some objects of the technosphere. Yes, you need to know in order to manipulate this part of the biosphere.
That is, humanity is just a part of the biosphere that performs certain functions.
Yes.
And there are no kings of nature there, but just a part, let's say dust mites to some extent.
Maybe it is so. But here again the question. Lyrics from Bender's song from the famous film, "They yield to me, I cannot refuse."
What is this for?
And this means that humanity decides for itself to be ticks on the body of the planet, or to, after all, be humanity. If there is pressure on the theme of reducing to the level of parasites, and there is no response that would block such pressure, then yes, the Overton window technology works when at first the unacceptable, through successive steps in a certain interconnected chain, becomes the norm of everyday life. Recall the film, Some Like It Hot. Last scene, marry me. No. Why? After all, I'm a man. Everyone has their own shortcomings. The film was released onto screens in 1959. The theme of same-sex marriage is at the level of hee ha ha. It can't be, but you can laugh at it. Several decades pass, and what?
By the way, this is one of the few films of that time that was translated and launched here in the USSR. Such a light comedy.
Yes, a light comedy, hee ha ha.
Another question. What we know about the previous civilization is that the Atlanteans, they were physically different from the usual mass of the rest of humanity. It turns out that their descendants must somehow inherit physical size or some other qualities.
As a variant, on the basis of certain psycho practices going into invisibility or parallel existence, or going to some area on the planet to where others have no access.
It is possible that all mass media are ultimately controlled from one global center. It is just this theme. There are people somewhere who are different from others, just in the mass media.
Yes, it won't get there. These are again questions of structureless governance and its organization. But even if we assume that the Atlantean giants are extinct, then the question still remains about the variativeness of upbringing. And there are subcultures that allow one thing, namely pedagogical subcultures, and block the other. And there are subcultures which... In general, the main dominant pedagogical culture in a crowd elite society is bonsai. Not in relation to a plant, however, but in relation to a person. Suppress development, first of all, suppress the development of the right hemisphere. If the right hemisphere is suppressed, then the informational algorithmic system of the computer and the psyche, as an informational algorithmic system, differ only in the power and productivity of the element base. Governance in language, where there is a certain lexicon, grammar, and the meaning of the identifier is assigned one way or the other by an external operator.
A question in relation to the study of history. Now, in addition to the main version of history, there are a very large number of additional ones that either contradict it or otherwise explain it in some other way. The same Fomenko and Nosovsky are the most well known. Then, on the internet, if you read, there are so many things. But there are versions that are frankly delusional, which a person simply sucks out of his finger, or even he does not fully comprehend. It is visible for him, everything collapses there. And there are quite curious assumptions, and quite logically well built. How should we relate to all this? That is, official historians say, do not look there, they are all amateurs. By no means, only we will tell you the truth, based on written sources that we all found in the 19th century. How should an ordinary person behave in all this?
Firstly, the case is that an ordinary person, raised in a crowd elite culture, in principle, does not own the methodology of cognition.
Yes, what they give him in his mouth, he will eat it.
Therefore, from his point of view, someone likes the priest, someone likes the priest's wife, someone likes the priest's daughter. The same is the case with the conceptions of the historical past, that is, giving an unmotivated preference to one version or the other. If you offer a true version of the historical past in this set of versions, then it will simply get lost in it. Therefore, the answer is simple: to master the methodology of cognition and to be critical of all versions. In addition, the methodology of cognition, it, in one way or the other, should be connected with what is called intuition. And intuition should also be under the power of sophist. Therefore, if a person reaches this level, then he will have claims in relation to all versions. So, the conception of social safety, it is not a question of which version of history is true. This is the question about the fact that everyone should reach the level of mastering the methodology of cognition and creativity in order not to be hostages of these or those ideologies, of which the conception of the historical past is also a part. If a person reaches this level, then there exist 6 groups of objective laws to which the life of human society is subordinated. These are pan-biospheric objective laws, species-specific, noospheric religious, nravious ethical in their character, which regulate the interrelationships between the carriers of reason, social cultural. Since culture is variative, then we can build a culture that will kill society over the course of the life of several generations, or we can build a culture that will ensure the life of society in the continuity of generations, in harmony with the biosphere, and the freeing of creative potential for the solution of some other tasks about which we now cannot even guess. Further, there are economic objective laws and governorial objective laws. If a person reaches the level of mastery of methodology, then he encounters this set of objective laws. He cognizes them. They are not unknown to him, and the desire to live well and live well for everyone. It leads to the fact that for each of them, in the aspect of sociology, the metaphor twice 2 is 4 will work. And not twice 2 is from 3 to 5, as it is now, pluralism of opinions. That is, the diagnostics of problems will always be recognizably identical, and by virtue of the fact that the set of optimal solutions is usually narrow, then people who possess the methodology of cognition will issue that optimal solution independently of each other. And since, if there is a dictatorship of sophist, then the principles, when I am right, and I am always right, and its variations, I am the boss, you are a fool, you are the boss, I am the fool, do not work. This is a different quality of the life of society, but the transition to it is impossible by a declarative order, that from tomorrow on, we will all begin to live according to our sophist. For the simple reason that during this evening and night, not everyone will be able to find sophist in their psyche.
And whoever cannot live according to his service tomorrow, we will punish him. Another final question. When two parties cannot agree with each other, is it a manifestation of the fact that they adhere to different conceptions of governance?
In general, this is on the theme of the tandem principle of activity. Because if there are mutually exclusive opinions on one and the same question, then you need to dig for the reasons. The reasons may be different informedness, that is, one knows what the other does not know, and if you notify the second about what the one knows, then the opinions will coincide. Second question, a version of the methodology of cognition used by both. If the version of one of them is in some way defective, then it does not allow the solution of those problems that the other can successfully solve. That is, this is a discussion of questions of nosology, the theory of cognition, as we understand it. If a uniform understanding of the methodology of cognition is achieved on this, further the question of glitches in the psyche as such arises. That is, if a comrade thinks that twice 2 is from 3 to 5, depending on the circumstances, and the other thinks that twice 2 is always 4, and this is for sure, then you need to find where the psyche of the first is glitching. And the next level is questions of nraviousness, because all processes of information processing in the system of senses of the psyche of man, they are nraviously conditioned. And if it turns out that their nravia standards are different, or that one has no nravia standards at all on some problematics, then, even with the same informedness, with the same understanding of the methodology of cognition, in the absence of such obvious glitches in the psyche when twice 2 this is not 4 but from 3 to 5 or otherwise, they will still come to different opinions. Then the question arises of the revision of the nraviousness of one or the other on the subject of correspondence of it to praviousness. That is, the theme is very large. But the solution to this problem is excluded if everyone stands on the position, when I am right, and I am always right, or Panikovsky syndrome, and who are you? Another version, I am the boss, you are the fool, you are the boss, I am the fool.
But the first commandment says that you love the Almighty with all your heart and mind. If we talk about the practice of life, then besides how to live according to совесть, how can this manifest itself?
This cannot manifest itself in any way except in living according to совесть. But the fact is, apparently, this commandment is not the first. When the Quran relates about the revelation to Moses, it all starts with the words, "Fear not." Because if there are fears in the psyche, then there is no place for love. If there are no fears, then this does not mean that there is love, but the basis has been created for love to appear.
But fearlessness and all permissiveness.
Yes, there can be all permissiveness on the basis of fearlessness. That is, if there are no fears, Further, there is a fork in the road. Either all permissiveness or love. But if there are fears, then all permissiveness can also manifest itself, because when someone is squeezed into a corner, then there are a lot of fears, and further, all permissiveness begins. And if there are no fears, then possibilities for love open up, but possibilities for all permissiveness also open up, and a person in general must decide for himself what he chooses. What I want, that I do, and if you don't agree, then show that you are cooler. Or he chooses love.